The moment the Duke of Ashenvale pointed across the crowded ballroom and said, "I want her," the one in the corner, the scarred sister, every candle in Whitmore Hall seemed to hold its breath. Before we go any further into this extraordinary story, dear friends, if you are watching this right now, drop in the comments where you are watching from. Whether you are tucked in bed in London, sitting in a cafe in Lagos, or wrapped in a blanket somewhere in the cold, let us know you are here. And if this story already has your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by every soul who has ever felt invisible. Now let us go back to that ballroom, where a single sentence just changed everything. It was the 14th of February, 1843, and the Whitmore family had spent every shilling remaining to their name on this evening. The candles alone had cost more than the cook's quarterly wages. The flowers, white roses and winter jasmine, had been ordered from a hothouse in Bath and transported through freezing roads, wrapped in oilcloth and desperate hope. The Whitmore daughters had been pressed and primped and powdered since dawn, their mother moving between them like a general before battle, adjusting a curl here, pinching color into a pale cheek there. There were 3 daughters of notable standing in that ballroom. Cecilia, the eldest, was considered the jewel of the county, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with a laugh that made men forget their own names. Beside her stood Margot, darker and more mysterious in her beauty, with a wit sharp enough to be considered charming rather than dangerous. Both women had been displayed that evening like prized paintings in a gallery, angled toward the light, their best features made more brilliant by deliberate positioning. And then, in the far corner of the room, half behind a curtain of winter ivy and shadow, stood Elara. She was 23 years old, the youngest of the Whitmore daughters, and she had not been invited to stand in the light. She had dressed herself quietly in a gown of deep blue, not the fashionable pale shades her sisters wore, but a color she had chosen for herself, because no one had thought to choose for her. Her dark hair was pinned simply. Her gloves were long, covering the faint scarring that traced its way from her left wrist to her elbow. And on the left side of her face, beginning at the temple and curving softly toward her jaw, the scarring bloomed like a map of old fire, silver and rose pink against her warm skin, permanent, undeniable, and entirely her own. She was not supposed to be at this ball. Her mother had suggested, in that careful, gentle tone that was somehow crueler than shouting, that Elara might be more comfortable upstairs, that the guests would find it easier, that Cecilia and Margot needed the room to breathe and shine without distraction. Elara had come downstairs anyway. Not out of defiance, exactly. Not out of hope, either. She had extinguished hope like a candle years ago, quietly and practically, the way one does when keeping it lit causes more pain than the dark. She had come downstairs because the ivy in the corner needed trimming, and she had spotted it from the staircase landing. And the particular brand of invisibility she had perfected over 9 years meant that she could cross a crowded room, snip 3 stems, and return without a single person's gaze snagging on her face. She had been trimming the ivy, actually trimming it, small scissors drawn from her pocket, when the doors of Whitmore Hall opened and the room changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, a collective intake of breath. The sound of conversation dimming the way a fire dims when someone opens an outside door. She turned, scissors still in hand, and saw him. Adrian Calloway, the 8th Duke of Ashenvale, was not what the rumors had prepared her for. The rumors said reclusive. They said damaged. They said dangerous, though no one could agree on the nature of the danger. They said he had not attended a social function in 6 years, not since the incident. And here the rumors always lowered their voices, because no one was entirely sure what the incident had been, only that it had closed him away from the world like a book snapped shut mid-sentence. What Elara saw was a man of perhaps 35, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black with such austere simplicity that he looked like a shadow that had learned to stand upright. His face was angular and serious, framed by dark hair touched at the temples with early gray. There was a scar. She noticed it immediately, because she noticed scars the way other people notice smiles, running along his jaw on the right side, pale and clean, the kind left by something sharp and deliberate. His eyes, even across the length of the ballroom, were the gray of deep water before a storm. He had come with no introduction, no announcement. He had simply arrived, as though the world had no right to make demands of him regarding timing. Lady Whitmore descended on him within seconds, fluttering and breathless, gesturing toward Cecilia, then Margot, her voice pitched at that particular frequency reserved for important men and stubborn creditors. Alara watched from her corner, invisible as always, as her mother performed the careful choreography of presentation. The Duke listened. He looked at Cecilia with the polite absence of a man looking through a window at a garden that did not interest him. He looked at Margot with the same courteous vacancy. And then, slowly, with a deliberateness that made Alara's chest tighten with inexplicable premonition, his gaze traveled across the room and found her. She did not move. She was not certain she breathed. His eyes held hers for a long moment, not with pity, not with the morbid curiosity she had learned to recognize and brace against, but with something else entirely. Something quiet and searching and strangely focused, as though he had been looking for exactly this, and had not expected to find it so simply. He turned to her mother. "I want her," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the absolute certainty of a man unaccustomed to being told no. The one in the corner, the scarred sister. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alara had ever heard. Cecilia's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Margot turned so sharply the pearls at her throat trembled. Lady Whitmore's carefully painted smile fractured at the edges, and for a moment she looked as though she might simply cease to exist from the shock of it. 3 aunts, 2 cousins, and a family friend who had come only for the food all turned toward the corner simultaneously, as though pulled by a single string. And Alara. Alara stood with her small scissors in her gloved hand, a sprig of winter ivy at her feet, and felt the entire architecture of the life she had built around invisibility begin, without warning, to crack. Alara Whitmore had not always known how to be invisible. It was a skill, like embroidery or French conjugation, that required years of patient, painful practice before it became second nature. She had been 14 years old when the fire happened. It was a December evening, and the details she remembered were not the ones people expected. They expected her to remember the pain. And yes, the pain had been extraordinary, the kind that rewrites the body's understanding of itself permanently. They expected her to remember the flames. But what Alara remembered most clearly, in the way that certain moments crystallize into permanent glass, was the sound of her mother's voice in the hallway outside the room where she lay bandaged and fevered 3 days later. "Will it scar badly?" her mother had asked the physician. And the physician, who was a kind man but an honest one, had said, "I am afraid so, Lady Whitmore." Significantly, the left side of her face and portions of her arm. There had been a silence then. Not the silence of grief, exactly. Not the silence of a mother absorbing terrible news about her child suffering. It was a different kind of silence, a calculating silence, the kind that precedes a reorganization of plans. Alara, lying in the dark behind a partially open door, had heard it clearly. She had understood it even at 14, because she had always been perceptive in the way that quiet children often are, drinking in the truth of things that loud children miss entirely. The other 2 girls, her mother had finally said carefully, will be unaffected? Completely, the physician confirmed. Another silence. Then softly, well, then we shall simply have to manage. Alara had closed her eyes. Something had shifted inside her then, not broken, not exactly, because she would not grant that word to what her mother had done in that hallway. But shifted, rearranged. Like furniture moved in the night, so that in the morning you keep reaching for things that are no longer where you expected them to be. The years that followed were, outwardly, ordinary enough. She healed. She resumed her lessons. She ate at the family table and attended church on Sundays and learned to paint watercolors with modest competence. No one was cruel to her in an obvious way. The Whitmores were too well bred for obvious cruelty. What they practiced instead was a quieter art, the art of omission. Alara was simply not included in certain conversations, certain plans, certain futures. When Cecilia made her debut at 17, there were 3 new gowns and a string of pearls and a subscription to 2 London lending libraries as gifts, because Lady Whitmore believed a well-read girl made better conversation. When Margot debuted 2 years later, the celebration was slightly smaller, but no less sincere. A watercolor set, a silk shawl, a letter of introduction to a countess in Bath. When Alara's own 17th birthday arrived and no debut was mentioned, she did not ask. She had learned by then that asking only made the omission audible. Instead, she built a life in the margins. She became the family's quiet engine, the one who managed the household accounts when her father's gambling made them complicated, which was often. She learned to speak to tradespeople and solicitors in the precise, measured tone that conveyed authority without inviting commentary on her appearance. She read voraciously and without guidance, pulling books from the Whitmore Library in great undiscriminating armfuls. Philosophy beside poetry, beside agricultural theory, beside Gothic novels, because no one monitored what she read. And in that freedom she found something that felt, on good days, almost like joy. She tended the gardens. She corresponded, under her father's signature, with several of his business associates when his hands shook too badly from drink to write coherently. She learned to be useful in ways that were invisible precisely because they were so constant. The way a foundation is invisible because the house above it is what everyone sees. And she learned, with careful and dedicated practice, to disappear in a room full of people. It was not about literally hiding, though she did sometimes choose corners and curtained alcoves. It was something more internal, a quality of stillness she cultivated. A way of dimming her own presence the way one turns down a lamp. She would enter a room and almost immediately become part of its architecture, noticed no more than the wallpaper or the clock on the mantel. She had refined this skill so thoroughly that she sometimes startled servants who had forgotten she was there, and had on more than one occasion overheard conversations not meant for any ears at all. It was, she had told herself in the privacy of her own mind, a kind of superpower. An eccentric and largely useless superpower, perhaps, but hers entirely. What she had never allowed herself to examine too closely was the cost of it. The cost lived in small, precise moments. It lived in the way she sometimes stood at her bedroom window at dusk and watched the road that led away from Whitmore Hall, not with any specific longing, because she had long since stopped allowing herself specific longings. It lived in the way she read love stories, and she did read them compulsively, without apology, and felt not envy exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of wistful archaeological interest in an emotion she treated as a historical artifact. Something real to other people in other centuries. Not for her. She was not bitter. That was the thing people sometimes misread when they looked at her. Those who looked at all. They saw the scars and the quietness and the careful way she held herself and assumed bitterness, assumed damage in the brittle and broken sense. But Alara was not brittle. She had been tested for brittleness repeatedly by the years and had discovered instead that she was something tougher and more flexible. Like River Cane, her old nurse had once said, which bends in the storm and rights itself after. She had built something from her invisible life. It was smaller than what most women her age were building. No household of her own, no husband, no children she rocked in lamplit rooms. But it was honest, and it was hers, and she had made a kind of peace with it that she was careful not to examine too vigorously, in case the peace turned out to be only a very convincing performance of peace. And then a duke had looked across a crowded ballroom and found her in her corner, and said her name without knowing her name, and the carefully constructed architecture of her invisible life had developed, quite without her permission, a crack. She had retreated upstairs immediately after the Duke's declaration, slipping through the stunned crowd with the ease of long practice, while her mother recovered her composure and her sisters exchanged blazing glances, and every guest in the room began the urgent business of deciding what they had just witnessed. She had climbed the stairs quietly and closed her bedroom door and stood with her back against it in the dark. Her heart was doing something she did not entirely trust. It was not a calm heart at the moment. It was a heart that had been startled out of a long, careful sleep and was now blinking in unfamiliar light, disoriented and a little frightened, and underneath both of those things, in some deep subterranean place she had sealed off with great intention years ago, something that might, if she was not very careful, become hope. She pressed her palms flat against the door behind her. "No," she said quietly to the empty room, to herself, to the treacherous something in her chest. But the crack, once made, does not close simply because one instructs it to. There were two versions of Adrian Calloway that existed in the world, and the tragedy was that neither of them was entirely true. The first version lived in drawing rooms and ladies' correspondence, and the whispered conversations that happen at the edges of ballrooms. The version built from rumor and romantic speculation and the particular human hunger for a compelling story. In this version, the Duke of Eschenvale was a brooding villain of Gothic proportions. Dangerous, possibly murderous, certainly mad. The scar on his jaw was variously attributed to a duel fought over a married woman, a punishment exacted by a cuckolded husband, a wound received in some disreputable foreign escapade, and in the most dramatic telling, favored by a particular aunt in Shropshire, the mark of a curse laid by a Romani woman he had wronged on a country road in his youth. He had locked himself in a Eschenvale castle for 6 years, the story went, because the world had finally recognized what he was and closed its doors to him. And so he had closed his own doors first, in defiance. The second version lived in the memories of the small number of people who had actually known him, his solicitor, his 3 remaining household staff who had weathered all 6 years of his solitude, his former commanding officer, now retired to Devon, and his cousin Frederick, who visited twice yearly and reported to no one because he was the rare kind of man who understood that other people's truths were not his to distribute. In this version, Adrian Calloway was something far less dramatic and far more painful than a villain. He was simply a man who had loved the world with an openness he had not known was dangerous until the world used that openness against him with surgical precision, and who had afterward concluded, quietly and with great deliberateness, that the risk was not worth repeating. The truth, as is customary, lived somewhere between the two versions, and was more complicated than either. He had been, in his younger years, genuinely remarkable. Not in the showy, self-conscious way of men who know they are remarkable and arrange themselves accordingly, but in the quiet way of someone whose gifts seemed to surprise even himself. He had studied at Oxford with distinction, not because distinction was expected of a duke's heir, but because he was genuinely, almost embarrassingly curious about everything. Languages, engineering, philosophy, the migratory patterns of birds, the mathematics underlying musical composition. He had a mind that could not rest and a temperament that found, in learning, something close to peace. He had gone to war at 26. Not because his rank required it. It did not, but because he had believed, with the earnest conviction of a young man who has read a great deal of history and processed very little actual suffering, that there were things worth fighting for, and that a man of his advantages had a particular obligation to stand at the front of them. He had served for 3 years in conditions that rearranged everything he thought he knew about humanity, both its capacity for brutality and its capacity for extraordinary, bewildering grace. He had come home changed in ways he could not fully articulate, carrying things inside him that had no adequate language, and had found, to his initial relief, that the world seemed perfectly prepared to take him back exactly as though he had never left. The scar on his jaw was real. It had come from a French cavalry sword, quickly and cleanly, during a retreat that should have been better organized and was not. He did not think about it much. It was simply part of his face now. The way the gray at his temples was simply part of his face, evidence of time and experience, neither shameful nor particularly interesting. What had broken him, in the end, was not the war. Her name had been Isabel Fontaine, and she had been, in the season of 1837, considered the most beautiful and charming woman in London, which was a city that took both beauty and charm very seriously. Adrian had met her at a musicale in March and had been struck, not immediately, because he was not a man who fell quickly, but steadily, over the course of several weeks, in the way that deep water fills rather than floods. He had admired her wit first, then her laugh, then the way she spoke about music with a genuine, informed passion that seemed to him entirely real. It was entirely real. That was the thing he had to remind himself of afterward. in the long, honest accounting he made of the situation during his first year of solitude. Her passion for music had been real. Several of her qualities had been real. What had not been real was her interest in him. Her interest had been in a Shenvale, the estate, the income, the title, the social elevation. These were not unusual motivations. Adrian was not naive enough to have been unaware that such calculations existed. What he had not anticipated, in his particular brand of openness, was the extent to which a person could simulate warmth and intimacy and what appeared to be genuine recognition, the feeling of being truly seen by another person, as a deliberate instrument of acquisition. He had believed she saw him. He had structured an entire future around that belief. The engagement had been announced in October. By December, he had discovered, through a combination of an unlocked writing desk and a letter he had not intended to read but could not stop reading, that Isabel had maintained throughout their entire courtship a parallel correspondence with her cousin, a detailed, affectionate, and frequently amusing record of her management of the Duke of Shenvale, which was the phrase she used, as one might say the management of an estate or the management of a difficult horse. The letters described his vulnerabilities with clinical accuracy. They described his longing to be known, his tendency to trust what felt genuine, his gratifying readiness to believe in her. He had read the letters twice. Then he had closed the desk. Then he had ended the engagement, quietly and without public explanation, because he saw no purpose in destroying her publicly when the only thing it would demonstrate was the depth of his own humiliation. And then, with the same deliberateness with which he had once arranged his life around openness, he had arranged it around withdrawal. A Shenvale received him. The old castle on its windswept moorland had always suited him in a way that London never quite had. Its silences were honest, its demands were straightforward, and it required nothing of him emotionally that he was not prepared to give. He managed his estates with precision. He read. He corresponded with his solicitor and his cousin, and occasionally with a professor of ornithology in Edinburgh, with whom he shared an interest in the winter migration of fieldfares. He was, in the way of a man who has simplified his life to its most sustainable elements, content. He did not expect it to last forever. He was not a man given to self-pity or dramatic gestures, and permanent solitude had always seemed to him an overreaction rather than a solution. He had simply needed time, distance, the particular quietude that comes from removing oneself from the conditions that cause the wound, long enough for the wound to become something one could carry without it commanding every step. By the winter of 1843, he was beginning, cautiously, to reconsider. It was Frederick who had first mentioned the Whitmore ball, mentioned it the way he always delivered information he thought Adrian needed, sideways and without pressure, embedded in a longer conversation about something else entirely. Something about the family's financial difficulties, a mother with 3 daughters to place, a county event that several people of reasonable quality would attend. Adrian had listened without responding, which Frederick knew by long experience meant he was filing it away. What Frederick did not know, what Adrian had told no one, was the particular reason the Whitmore family's name had lodged itself in his attention. He had seen Elara Whitmore once before, 8 months prior, in the market town of Ashford, 12 miles from the Whitmore estate. He had been there on business related to a drainage dispute on one of his tenant farms, and she had been at a stationer's shop, selecting paper with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom the selection genuinely mattered. He had noticed her first because of the scar, not with the flinching or the staring that he had observed in others, but with a recognition that surprised him with its immediacy. And then he had noticed the way she stood, straight and self-possessed and entirely unself-conscious, and the way she spoke to the shopkeeper with a directness and warmth that suggested a person entirely comfortable in her own competence. She had chosen her paper, paid precisely, thanked the man by name, and left without once performing any of the small social anxieties he had become accustomed to seeing in women who understood themselves to be observed. She had not seen him. He had not introduced himself. He was not, at that point, in a season of introduction. But she had stayed in his mind in the way that genuinely interesting things stay, not obsessively, not romantically, not yet, but with a persistent quality of interest, like a question one returns to because it seems to contain something worth understanding. He had gone to the Whitmore ball to see if the woman in the stationer's shop and the hidden daughter of a desperate family were truly the same person. They were. And standing in that ballroom, watching her trim ivy in a corner with the calm practicality of a woman who has long since decided to be useful rather than decorative, Adrian Calloway had felt something unlock in his chest that he had not realized, until that precise moment was still locked. The morning after the ball, Alara came downstairs to find her family already assembled in the front parlor, which meant something serious was happening, because the Whitmores did not assemble before noon without compelling reason. They were arranged, she noticed immediately, with unconscious theatrical instinct, her mother at the center of the settee like a general at a campaign table, Cecilia to her left with her arms crossed and her expression arranged into the specific configuration that meant she was furious but had decided to be strategic about it, and Margot at the window, which was her habitual position when she wanted to appear indifferent while actually listening with complete attention. Her father was not present, which was not unusual. Her father was rarely present for family councils. He had a study and a decanter and a particular talent for making himself unavailable when the household required difficult decisions. Alara paused in the doorway. She had slept badly and risen early and spent the better part of the dark morning hours reading a treatise on medieval agricultural practices, which was not what she had wanted to read, but was the most boring thing she could locate in the Whitmore library, deployed as a deliberate sedative against thoughts she was not prepared to have. It had not entirely worked. "Sit down, Alara," her mother said. She sat. What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that Alara participated in largely as an object under discussion rather than a person conducting a discussion. The Duke's offer, for it was an offer, Lady Whitmore explained, a formal and serious one, conveyed through a solicitor by 9 o'clock that very morning with a speed that suggested a man unaccustomed to uncertainty about his own intentions, was presented, examined, questioned, and ultimately endorsed by her mother with a particular brand of enthusiasm that Alara recognized as financial desperation, wearing the costume of maternal delight. The terms were straightforward, as these things went. A marriage contract. A settlement that would resolve the Whitmore family's more pressing debts. And they were, Alara knew from her management of the household accounts, pressing, indeed. A title for Alara, which Lady Whitmore repeated twice, as though still adjusting to the sound of it. And a Shenvale, which even in its rumored strangeness, was one of the great estates of the North. Cecilia wanted to know why. Her voice was controlled, but the question was sharp and unadorned. Why Alara? Of all the women in that room, why the one who? And here Cecilia stopped herself, because even in her frustration, she retained enough self-awareness to recognize that finishing that sentence would reveal something unflattering about herself. Lady Whitmore said that the Duke's reasons were his own, and that what mattered was the offer, which was extraordinary, and the family situation, which was urgent, and the solution, which was elegant, and that she hoped everyone could appreciate the fortunate alignment of all three. Margot, from the window, said nothing, but she looked at Alara once briefly, and Alara read in her sister's dark eyes something that might have been not guilt, because Margot was not built for guilt, but something adjacent, an acknowledgement, a flicker of some complicated thing that was gone before Alara could name it. No one asked Alara what she wanted. They asked her at the end of the 40 minutes whether she had any objections, which was a different question entirely. She said she would meet the Duke before deciding anything. Her mother blinked, as though this were an eccentric and slightly inconvenient request. But she agreed because the alternative, Alara's refusal, was unthinkable, and because perhaps she understood, in some calcified corner of her maternal instinct, that Alara had spent 9 years accommodating the family's needs without complaint and had earned, at minimum, this. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon in the Whitmore Library, which was the most neutral ground the house offered. Alara chose the library deliberately. It was her room, in all the ways that mattered. She knew every shelf, every draft, every particular creak of the floorboards near the east window. If she was going to meet a Duke who had upended her invisible life with 5 words, she was going to do it on ground where she had the advantage. She arrived 10 minutes early and positioned herself not in the chair closest to the door, which would have suggested anxiety, a desire for proximity, to escape, but in the wing back near the fire, with a book open in her lap that she was absolutely not reading. He arrived precisely on time. She had thought, in the cold light of morning, that she might have misremembered him, that the impression of him from the ballroom, the gravity, the contained intensity, the strange quality of his attention, might have been an artifact of the shock and the candlelight and her own disoriented state. She had thought he might arrive in daylight and prove to be ordinary. He was not ordinary. He was in the gray afternoon light filtering through the library windows, exactly as she had perceived him the night before, large and dark and very still, with those deep water eyes that moved to her face immediately and stayed there without the flicker or the careful neutral adjustment she was accustomed to receiving from people encountering her scars for the first time. He looked at her the way she looked at books she was genuinely interested in, directly, without apology, with the settled focus of someone who intends to understand what they are looking at. She found it profoundly disconcerting. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice, she was relieved to discover, was entirely steady. He took the chair across from her, without waiting for an invitation, which she noted. Not rudeness. He was not a rude man. She could read that immediately. Simply a man unaccustomed to performing the social rituals of request and permission, because 6 years of solitude had made such rituals feel artificial. She understood the impulse, even if the execution required adjustment. "You wanted to meet before agreeing to anything," he said. "That is sensible." "I thought so," she said. "You have questions?" "Several." "Ask them." It was not a gracious invitation. It was not a charming one. It was simply direct, and she found that she preferred it enormously to charm, which she had always suspected was a lubricant applied to things that did not move honestly on their own. She set the book aside and looked at him directly, because she had learned, in 9 years of being looked at, that looking back was the single most effective tool available to her. "Why me?" she said. "The honest answer, please. Not the polite one." Something moved in his expression, not quite surprise, but a recalibration, as though he had prepared for several versions of this conversation, and this particular version required a different set of materials. "I saw you once before last night," he said. "In Ashford. 8 months ago. At a stationer's shop." She searched her memory, and found it, a Tuesday in April, overcast, the smell of fresh paper and ink, the particular satisfaction of choosing exactly the right weight of writing stock. She had not noticed him. She had not noticed anyone particularly, that day, because she had been absorbed in the choosing. "You didn't introduce yourself," she said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I was not, at that point, in a position to be introducing myself to anyone." He said it without self-pity, simply as fact. "I was watching." "Watching me specifically?" "Yes." The directness of it landed between them without softening. She appreciated that he did not try to make it less strange than it was. "And what did you observe," she said carefully, "that brought you to a ballroom 6 years after you last attended one?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man who chooses his words the way a craftsman chooses tools, for fitness rather than decoration. "You were entirely yourself," he said. "In a public place where most people perform some version of what they believe is expected of them. You were simply yourself, focused on what you were doing, unbothered by observation, not performing anything." He paused. "I had forgotten that was possible." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest performed a complicated maneuver that she firmly instructed it to stop. "That is an unusual basis for a marriage proposal," she said. "I am aware." "What exactly would you want from this arrangement?" she asked. "In plain terms." He considered this with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "A companion," he said. "Someone to share a shenveil with, who would not find it a punishment. Someone whose company I could respect." "I am not," he stopped. Started again. "I am not looking for performance. I have had performance. I found it inadequate." Something about the careful restraint with which he said it told her there was a great deal more behind those words. She did not press. Not yet. "And what would I have?" she asked. "Freedom," he said, without hesitation. "From this house. From the particular position you occupy in it, which I suspect is not a comfortable one. Your own rooms, your own time, your own accounts. Ashenvale has an extraordinary library." The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but its first cousin. "Better than this one." She glanced involuntarily at the shelves around her shelves, her carefully organized beloved shelves, and then back at him, and found that he was watching her with an expression of such precise and quiet understanding that she had to look away. This man, she thought, was going to be considerably more difficult to manage than she had planned. "I will need time to think," she said. "Of course. A week." He nodded. She stood, which ended the meeting. Her library, her terms, her timing. He rose immediately, which she appreciated. At the door he paused, and she thought he might say something further, something that would tip the conversation into territory she wasn't ready for. Instead he said, simply, "The ivy in the ballroom corner, by the way. It needed trimming. You were right to do it." And then he was gone, and Alara stood in her library with her heart behaving in ways she had specifically instructed it not to, holding the certain knowledge that she was going to say yes, and the equally certain knowledge that saying yes was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. She suspected, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 9 years being honest with herself in lieu of any other audience, that it might be both. The carriage that came for Alara on the morning of her departure was not what she had expected. She had expected something austere, something that communicated, through its very design, the reclusive severity of its owner, black lacquer, perhaps, with minimal ornamentation, and the kind of functional grimness that announces a man who has given up on beauty as a category. She had prepared herself for it. She had packed her books, and her small scissors, and her writing materials, and her most sensible dresses, and she had said goodbye to her family in the front hall with the careful equanimity of a woman who has decided on a course of action and intends to see it through without the indulgence of visible emotion. Her mother had embraced her with genuine warmth for perhaps the first time in 9 years, which Alara found more unsettling than comfort. Cecilia had kissed her cheek and said, with what appeared to be sincere bewilderment, "I truly do not understand any of this, Alara." Margot had held her hands for a long moment and looked at her with those complicated dark eyes and said very quietly, "Write to me," in a tone that suggested she meant something larger than correspondence. Her father had emerged from his study to see her off, blinking in the morning light like a man interrupted in the middle of something important, and had gripped her shoulder with unexpected firmness and said, "You are always the sharpest of them, you know," which was possibly the most honest thing he had said to her in years, and which he was going to have to think about later, at a time when she could afford the feelings it produced. And then the carriage had arrived, and it was not austere at all. It was old, certainly. The Ashenvale crest on the door was worn to a comfortable familiarity rather than polished to aggressive display. But the interior was lined in deep green wool, soft and well maintained, and there were books in the door pocket. Actual books, not decorative ones, their spines creased with genuine use, and a small folded note on the seat that said, in a handwriting that was precise without being ornate, *, the journey is 4 hours. I thought you might prefer these to the scenery, though the scenery improves considerably after Marston Bridge. A.C*. Ilara read the note twice. Then she looked at the books. There were 3 of them. A collection of essays on natural philosophy, a novel she had mentioned in passing during their library conversation. Mentioned, she was almost certain, only once, as a secondary example in a longer point about something else entirely, and a slim volume of botanical illustrations with a handwritten index of northern Merlin plants tucked inside the front cover. She sat with the botanical volume in her lap for a long moment, looking at it, before she opened it. She was aware that she was being handled with great care, and that this care was, at present, the most threatening thing in her immediate situation. The scenery, as promised, improved after Marston Bridge. She pressed her face to the carriage window and watched England change around her, the soft, cultivated prettiness of the South giving way, gradually and then completely, to something older and less managed. The hills grew larger and more serious. The trees thinned and then almost vanished, replaced by the wide, wind-swept expanses of moorland that rolled away on all sides in shades of gray and brown and the deep, persistent green of heather and moss. The sky expanded. There was a quality to the light up here that she had never encountered before, flatter, cleaner, without the warm haze of the south, as though the air itself had been simplified. She found, to her own surprise, that she loved it immediately. A Shenvale castle appeared first as a darkness on the horizon, a mass against the pewter sky that was too angular and deliberate to be a hill. As the carriage drew closer it resolved into stone, a great deal of stone, for centuries of it at minimum, added to and modified by successive generations, so that the building was not architecturally coherent so much as architecturally honest. There were medieval towers and Georgian windows, and a Victorian addition on the east wing that someone had attempted to integrate with more ambition than success. It was not beautiful in any conventional or tidy sense. It was, Alara thought, pressing both hands against the cold glass of the carriage window, magnificent. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a small, upright woman of perhaps 60 called Mrs. Beale, who had the bearing of someone who has run a large household for a very long time and has strong opinions about how things should be done and the confidence to enforce them. She examined Alara with the frank, efficient assessment of a woman who has outlasted several iterations of this household's drama and intends to outlast several more, and then she nodded once, with the air of someone whose preliminary judgment has been, if not enthusiastic, at least not unfavorable. "Your rooms are ready, that is, your grace," Mrs. Beale said, and there was a fractional pause before the title that suggested she was still accustoming herself to its application. "The Duke asked me to tell you that dinner is at 7 if you wish to join him, but that a tray can be sent to your rooms if you prefer to rest after the journey." Alara noted the careful construction of this. An invitation, not an expectation. An alternative offered without pressure. She wondered if Adrian had instructed Mrs. Beale specifically in this phrasing, or whether Mrs. Beale had intuited it from long acquaintance with a man who understood the value of not being imposed upon. "I will join him for dinner," Alara said. "Thank you." Her rooms were in the east wing, which turned out to be considerably more pleasant than its exterior had suggested. High-ceilinged and south-facing, with windows that looked over a walled garden currently brown and dormant in the February cold, but architecturally beautiful, its bones suggesting what it would become in spring. The furniture was old but well-maintained, the bed enormous and covered in a quilt of deep blue and gold that she suspected was a deliberate choice rather than a coincidence. There was a writing desk positioned to catch the best morning light. There was a fireplace that burned with the settled confidence of a fire that has been properly laid by someone who knows what they are doing. And on the desk there was a small vase of winter jasmine. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Winter jasmine, she knew, did not grow on moorland. Someone had either maintained a hothouse or sent a considerable distance for it. It was the same flower that had decorated Whitmore Hall on the night of the ball. The night she had stood in her corner with her small scissors and her determined invisibility before everything changed. She did not know what to do with the precision of this gesture. She did not know how to file it or manage it or keep it at the careful arm's length she had assigned to all things that threatened to matter. So she set her traveling bag down and unpacked her books and her writing materials and her sensible dresses, and she told herself that winter jasmine was a common enough flower, and that she was assigning significance where there was likely only a housekeeper's decorative instinct. She did not entirely believe herself. Dinner was in a room that should have been cavernous and intimidating, but was, through some alchemy of firelight and arrangement, neither. The table had been set at one end, creating an intimate space within the larger room's architecture. Two settings close together rather than stranded at opposite ends of an expanse of mahogany. Adrian was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with a glass of wine, looking out at the moorland in the last gray light. He turned when she entered. He looked at her with that direct, uncomplicated attention that she was already beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. "You survived the journey," he said. "The books helped," she said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Which did you read?" "The botanical one mostly." though I read the first 30 pages of the essays and disagreed with the author's central premise almost immediately." He was quiet for a moment. "Which premise?" "That observation is inherently passive," she said. "He argues that the observer stands apart from what is observed. I think that is incorrect. I think observation changes both parties." He looked at her with an attention so complete and focused that she felt the way one feels a shift in air pressure, a physical adjustment, subtle and significant. "I have thought the same thing," he said. "For years. I have never heard anyone else say it." They stood on opposite sides of the firelit room and regarded each other across it, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have unexpectedly discovered adjacent territory in the landscape of their thinking, and who are not yet certain what to do with the discovery. Mrs. Beale arrived to serve, and the moment reorganized itself into dinner, into the ordinary business of passing bread and pouring wine and the careful, tentative conversation of two strangers learning the basic geography of each other. They spoke of books, and of the north, and of the moorland plants in the illustrated volume, and of the walled garden, which Adrian told her she was welcome to do with as she wished, because it had been left unattended for 3 years, and he had no particular vision for it. She asked about the household. He answered without evasion. The 3 indoor staff, the 2 groundsmen, the stable boy who wanted to be a printer, and whom Adrian was quietly funding through an apprenticeship in the town. This detail, delivered as an aside, without any apparent desire for credit, lodged itself in Alara's chest and stayed there. She returned to her rooms at 9 o'clock, earlier than she might have otherwise, because she needed to be alone with what the evening had been. She needed to examine it honestly and determine what she was dealing with. She sat at her writing desk in the firelight and looked at the winter jasmine, and what she determined, with the ruthless honesty she applied to herself above all things, was this: she was not dealing with what she had expected to deal with. She had expected distance, or performance, or the particular loneliness of proximity to someone fundamentally disinterested. She had prepared her internal landscape for cold. What she had not prepared for was the quiet possibility of warmth. And on the desk the following morning, she did not hear him, never heard him, though she was a light sleeper and the floorboards creaked, there was a new book. No note this time. Just the book, left outside her door at some hour before she woke, as though the leaving itself were sufficient communication. It was the book she had disagreed with at dinner, the Essays on Observation. On the inside cover, in that precise handwriting, a single line, underlined in the text at page 47, where the author had revised his earlier premise. The line read, "Perhaps the observer is always changed by what he chooses to attend to." Alara read it 3 times. Then she pressed it flat against the page with her palm, the way one presses a flower, trying to preserve the moment, without crushing what makes it beautiful. Outside, the moor stretched away under a pale winter sky, vast and honest and quietly, persistently alive. It began, as most significant things do, not with a dramatic gesture, but with something small. 3 weeks into her residence at Ashenvale, Alara discovered that the walled garden contained, beneath its 3 years of neglect, a formerly planted herb garden of considerable ambition. She found it on a Tuesday morning, while clearing dead growth with a pair of shears she had appropriated from the groundskeeper's shed. Found it the way one finds things that have been waiting patiently to be found, by paying attention when others had stopped. She was on her knees in the cold earth, pulling ivy from around what turned out to be a perfectly preserved stone border, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. Adrian stood at the garden gate. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one that meant he had arrived intending to say something, and had instead stopped to observe, and was now recalibrating. "You knew this was here," she said. "It was not a question." "My mother planted it," he said. "I had forgotten." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was in his working clothes, dark coat, no cravat, boots that had actually been worn outdoors, rather than merely threatened with the possibility. He looked, she thought, considerably more like himself than he did at dinner, where some vestigial formality still operated between them like a language they were both gradually forgetting. "Come and look," she said. He came. He crouched beside her in the cold dirt of the garden his mother had planted, and she showed him what she had found. The stone borders, the dormant root structures of lavender and rosemary, and what she believed was a substantial planting of meadowsweet. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet from his usual one. Softer at the edges. "She died when I was 11, he said, not in response to anything. Simply as information he had decided to offer. "I'm sorry," Alara said. And then, because she was not a woman who left important things unsaid when saying them cost only honesty, she had good taste. Something happened to his face then. It was brief and unguarded, a loosening, a momentary dissolution of the careful containment he wore as naturally as other men wore waistcoats. It was gone in seconds, but she had seen it, and she filed it away in the growing catalog she was keeping of Adrian Calloway, against her better judgment and with full awareness of the risk. That afternoon, he showed her the library. Not the public room she had already explored, but the private library on the 3rd floor, his actual library. The one with the reading chair positioned at the precise angle to the window that caught the best light. The one with the half-finished margins of his own handwriting annotating the books he had lived with longest. He showed it to her, without preamble, simply opened the door and stood aside. And she walked in and turned slowly in the center of the room and understood that this was not a casual sharing. This was trust, offered quietly, without fanfare, in the way he seemed to offer everything. They began spending afternoons there. Not by arrangement, neither of them suggested it or scheduled it, because something about the formality of arrangement felt wrong for what was happening between them. It simply began occurring. She would find herself in the library after lunch, and he would arrive within the hour, and they would read in their separate chairs in the winter light, occasionally in silence, and occasionally not. The conversations that grew from those afternoons were unlike any Alara had experienced before. Not because they were romantic, not yet. They were careful with each other still, maintaining certain distances with the mutual discretion of people who understand that what is fragile should not be rushed. But they were honest in a way that felt almost transgressive after a lifetime of careful social performance. They disagreed freely. They followed threads of thinking wherever they led without the self-consciousness of needing to appear intelligent, because they were both, simply and without vanity, intelligent, and this was something each recognized in the other without needing to perform it. He told her about his time in the war, not the violence, which he kept behind a door she did not push, but the particular quality of attention it had taught him. How extreme circumstance simplified perception. How he had learned to notice everything, because everything might matter. She told him about the fire, which she had told almost no one. Not the pain or the aftermath or the long rearrangement of her life around the scars, but the strange thing that had happened to her perception afterward. How she had become, in the years of her invisibility, an extraordinary observer. How being unseen had taught her to see. He was quiet for a long time after she said this. Then he said, "That is what I noticed in Ashford, in the stationer's shop. The quality of your attention." "You noticed my attention," she said, with a dryness that was not unkind. "Not my face." "Your face," he said, with complete evenness, "is part of what I noticed. All of it. The scars are part of your face. I did not see them separately from you." Alara looked at him across the library. The fire settled. Outside, the February wind moved across the moorland with its characteristic sound. Not howling, exactly, more like a long, sustained exhalation, the more breathing. She believed him. That was the thing she had not anticipated and could not now manage. She simply believed him. Not because she was naive or because she had abandoned her long practice of clear-eyed realism, but because she had spent enough weeks in close proximity to this man to understand that he did not say things he did not mean. He left things unsaid constantly, kept great territories of himself behind careful doors. But what he said he meant. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in early March, he laughed. She had said something about the essay author, the observation theorist, whose book she had now read twice and disagreed with comprehensively. Something about his fundamental confusion between attention and intrusion. She had put it in a particular way, with a particular image involving a very confused naturalist and a very patient badger, and Adrian had laughed. Not politely. Not the contained social version. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, and startled out of him, as though it had escaped before he could think better of it. He stopped almost immediately, with the self-consciousness of a man who has forgotten for a moment to be careful. She felt the laughter in her own chest like a struck bell, like a thing resonating long after the initial contact. "You should do that more often," she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, open and a little afraid, the way things are when they have been closed for a very long time, and the closing has become confused with safety. "Perhaps," he said, "I am beginning to find reason to." Alara looked back at her book. Her heart was doing the thing she had told it not to do. It was doing it anyway, with the calm persistence of a river that has found its direction and intends to follow it regardless of instruction. She understood with perfect clarity and significant alarm, falling in love with her husband. She found it by accident, which was the only honest way to describe it, though she knew that accidents of this particular kind are rarely entirely accidental. It was a Saturday in mid-March, and Adrian had ridden out to the eastern edge of the estate to meet with a tenant farmer whose drainage situation had been requiring attention since autumn. Mrs. Beale had gone to the market town with the cook. The house was quieter than usual, a particular, spacious quiet that Alara generally enjoyed, the kind that allowed her to move through rooms without the low-level awareness of other presences that was the constant background noise of a shared house. She had come to the third-floor library to return 2 books and take 3 more, which was her consistent net loss in any transaction with that room. She had returned the books to their proper places. She had learned his organizational system within the first week because it was logical and consistent and told her a great deal about how his mind worked, and was selecting her replacements when she noticed the writing desk in the corner. She had noticed it before without attending to it. It was a handsome piece, old walnut, positioned beneath the room's smallest window. She had assumed it was decorative or archival, the kind of desk that holds old correspondence and household records and the accumulated paperwork of an estate managed across generations. What she had not noticed before, because the desk had always been closed, was that it was today open. She would not have looked. She was not, by nature or practice, a person who examined what was not offered to her. 9 years of overhearing conversations not meant for her ears had made her, if anything, more rather than less careful about the boundaries of other people's private territory. She understood acutely what it felt like to have one's private self observed without consent. But the desk was open, and on its surface, clearly and unavoidably visible from where she stood, was a drawing. A pencil drawing, precise and detailed, the work of a careful and practiced hand. And the subject of the drawing was her. She crossed the room slowly. She was not certain her feet were making the decision. It felt more like a gravitational inevitability than a choice. She stood before the desk and looked at the drawing, and then at the others beneath it, because there were others. A small stack of them, perhaps a dozen, each one a study in pencil of the same subject. Herself. In various moments, she did not remember being observed. Herself reading in the library, caught in the particular posture she adopted when a book had entirely absorbed her. Spine curved, feet tucked beneath her, one hand raised to her temple. Herself in the walled garden, on her knees in the earth, examining something in the soil. Herself at the dinner table, mid-conversation, gesturing with her wine glass in the way she did when making a point she found particularly satisfying. Herself at the east window of her rooms, looking out at the moor in the early morning, her hair loose. That last one stopped her breathing for a moment. Not because it was intrusive. It was not. The angle suggested he had seen her from the garden below, nothing more. But because of how he had drawn her. The care in it. The attention. The particular quality of a hand that draws what it cannot stop seeing. Not the hand of a man sketching an interesting subject, but the hand of a man working through something that will not leave him alone. He had drawn her scars with the same careful attention as every other feature. Not minimized, not emphasized. Simply present. Simply hers. Part of the face he apparently found worth returning to, again and again, in the private hours when no one was watching him. Ilara set the drawings down. She stepped back from the desk. She needed air, and the library did not, at this moment, have sufficient quantities of it. She was on the moor path behind the house, walking with the focused energy of someone processing something too large to hold still for, when she heard the horse. Adrian returned an hour earlier than expected, which was either poor timing or the universe's commitment to completing the scene it had started. He saw her from the path above, dismounted, handed the reins to the stable boy, and came down the slope toward her with the unhurried stride of a man who has learned not to approach things at a run. He read her face when he reached her. He was very good at reading her face, better than anyone she had known, better in some ways than she was herself, which was its own alarming piece of information. "What happened?" he said. "Your desk was open," she said. "The library desk. I was returning books, and I saw." A silence. Not the comfortable kind. The containment she had watched him wear for months did something she had not seen it do before. It did not hold. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt exactly, not shame, something more complicated and more exposed than either. The look of a man whose most private room has been entered, and who is not certain whether to be frightened or relieved. "I see," he said. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady through the deliberate application of the same internal discipline she had used for years, though it was working considerably harder at the moment than usual. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with those deep water eyes that held, right now, something turbulent beneath their surface. "Since Ashford," he said. 8 months before the ball." She absorbed this. "You saw me once. In a stationer's shop. And you. I could not stop thinking about you." He said it plainly, without decoration. "I am aware that this is not a conventional or comfortable thing to say. I am telling you because you have found the drawings and the alternative is to lie, which I am unwilling to do. Most men," she said carefully, "who cannot stop thinking about a woman, pursue her, introduce themselves, make themselves known. Yes. You waited 8 months. You came to a ball. You asked for me in front of my entire family and half the county." "Yes." "Why?" She was asking the question she had asked at their very first meeting, but she meant something different now. Not why had he chosen her over her sisters. Why this? Why this particular, oblique, careful, overwhelming approach? Why the drawings? Why the books left outside her door? Why the winter jasmine? Why the botanical index with the hand-annotated moorland plants? He looked at her for a long time. The wind moved across the moorland between them, cold and honest. "Because I needed to be certain," he said, "that what I was responding to was real. I have," he stopped, "started again with the particular care of a man laying down something heavy. I have been mistaken before about what was real. I needed to know that you were, that the person I had observed was genuinely who she appeared to be. Before another stop. "Before you what?" she said quietly. "Before I allowed myself to want it," he said. "Her. You. Before I allowed myself to want you, knowing what wanting costs when you have been wrong before." The moor was very quiet around them. A curlew called somewhere in the middle distance, its sound curving up and away over the heather. Ilara looked at the man standing before her, contained and exposed simultaneously, offering her the truth of himself with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that offering it carelessly is catastrophic, and felt something shift in her own carefully maintained interior architecture. Not crack this time. Something more fundamental. Something closer to opening. And that was precisely what frightened her. Because she had built her life around the understanding that she was not someone people wanted. Not in this way. Not with this quality of attention and intention and careful, patient, overwhelming care. She had made peace with that understanding. She had constructed around it a life that was honest and functional, and, on good days, genuinely fulfilling. And if she allowed herself to believe that Adrian Calloway, with his deep water eyes and his pencil drawings and his books left outside her door before dawn, genuinely wanted her, not despite what she was, but because of it, not as a convenience or a calculation, but as a choice made with full awareness and deliberate intention, then she would have to dismantle the architecture. and she was not certain she could survive the demolition if it turned out she had been wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the honest restraint of a woman choosing survival over surrender, "I need time to think." She turned back toward the house. He did not follow, which was either consideration or understanding or both. The wind pushed at her back as she walked, as though even the moorland had an opinion about the direction she should go. She did not look back, but she felt his gaze on her until the path curved and the house rose up around her, and she carried the feeling of it all the way to her room, where she sat at the writing desk beside the winter jasmine and stared at the moor and understood, with painful clarity, that time was not actually what she needed. What she needed was courage, and she had not yet determined whether she possessed sufficient quantities of it. The Whitmore family arrived on a Wednesday unannounced, in a carriage that had not been cleaned since February. Alara saw them from the library window. Her window now, the third-floor one with the best light, the one she had claimed by simple persistence over the preceding weeks. She saw the carriage turn through a Shenvale's gate and felt something contract in her chest. Not fear exactly, something more precise. The particular bracing sensation of a person who has spent time away from a difficult environment and must now remember, very quickly, how to hold themselves within it. She had been at a Shenvale 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, she had become, quietly and without formal declaration, part of the house's rhythm. Mrs. Beale consulted her about the spring larder. The groundskeeper had begun leaving notes about the walled garden's progress tucked under her door alongside Adrian's books, the two communications arriving sometimes within hours of each other, which produced in her a domestic contentment she was careful not to examine too thoroughly. She had begun, tentatively, to think of the East Wing rooms as hers. She had begun, rather less tentatively, to think of the man who inhabited the rest of the house as someone she understood. 3 days had passed since the drawings. 3 days of careful, quiet distance, not cold, not hostile, simply the mutually respected space of two people allowing something difficult to settle. He had left a book outside her door each morning. She had not sought him out. He had not pressed. They had eaten dinner together on 2 of the 3 evenings, maintaining conversation about the walled garden and the moorland birds, and a philosophical disagreement about the nature of memory that had become, without either of them naming it as such, a thread they returned to and picked up and continued across multiple evenings, like a piece of work they were doing together. The distance was closing. She could feel it closing, the way one feels weather approaching, a change in pressure, a particular quality of awareness. And then the carriage had come through the gate. She went downstairs because there was no useful alternative. Retreating to her rooms would accomplish nothing except the postponement of whatever her mother had come to accomplish, and Alara had spent enough of her life in postponement. Lady Whitmore entered a Shenvale's front hall with the bright, assessing energy of a woman taking inventory. Her gaze moved across the stone walls and the old furniture and the high ceilings with the rapid calculation of someone converting aesthetic impressions into financial estimates. Cecilia followed, less interested in the architecture, her attention moving immediately to Alara with an expression of concentrated appraisal that suggested she had spent the journey preparing several things she intended to say. Margot came last. She caught Alara's eye and gave a small, private shrug that communicated volumes. Asterisk, I tried to dissuade them. I failed. I am sorry, asterisk. Alara, darling. Her mother embraced her with the warmth of a woman who has decided, for today's purposes, to be maternal. You look, a fractional pause, the kind that contains entire paragraphs. Well, you look well. Thank you, Alara said. I am well. The house is very, another pause. Dramatic. I find it beautiful, Alara said. Her mother's smile remained stable through this, which was a considerable social achievement. Adrian appeared from the direction of his study, with the unhurried calm of a man who has been informed of unexpected guests, and has decided to receive them on his own terms rather than theirs. He was formally dressed, not elaborately, but correctly, which Alara recognized as a deliberate choice. He shook her father's hand, exchanged pleasantries with a precision that was courteous without being warm, and then positioned himself beside Alara with a naturalness that was not theatrical but was, she noted, entirely deliberate. Beside her, not across the room, not at the head of the arrangement, performing the host's role from a commanding distance. Beside her, as though this were simply where he stood. Her mother noticed. Cecilia noticed. Alara noticed, most of all. They were installed in the drawing room. Tea was produced. And then, with the careful indirection of a woman who has spent 40 years getting what she wants without appearing to want it, Lady Whitmore began. It started with observations about the estate, its size, its history, its considerable value. Then observations about the family situation, which had apparently not improved as dramatically as the marriage settlement had initially promised, due to certain debts that had not been fully disclosed in the original accounting. Then suggestions, gentle, elaborately casual suggestions, about the possibility of a revised arrangement. Additional support. A more permanent and generous understanding between the Duke and his new wife's family. Alara listened with the stillness she had perfected over years. She watched her mother perform and felt the old familiar mixture of exhaustion and something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but occupied the territory between them. Then Cecilia, who had been quiet with the focused restraint of someone holding something back until the right moment, looked at Alara directly and said, "You must admit this is all rather extraordinary. That he chose you." A small crystalline pause. "We have all been wondering whether there is something practical in the arrangement. On his side, whether he required a wife who would make fewer social demands. Someone content to be tucked away." The drawing room was very quiet. Alara felt the words land. She had been landed on before. She knew the specific weight of this particular kind of blow, the one that wears the costume of honest curiosity, while delivering something that is neither honest nor curious. She opened her mouth. She did not speak first. "Miss Whitmore." Adrian's voice was quiet and entirely without heat, which made it considerably more effective than anger would have been. He was looking at Cecilia with an attention so focused and so still that Cecilia, to her credit, had the instinct to recognize it as something she should take seriously. "I want to be certain I understood you correctly. You are suggesting that I married your sister because her social presence would be inconvenient? That I chose her because I believed she would require less?" Cecilia's composure held, but only just. "I meant no offense. I only—" "You meant a great deal," Adrian said. Still quiet. Still without heat. "You simply preferred that it not be identified." Lady Whitmore attempted an interjection. He turned to her with the same focused quiet and she subsided, which Alara suspected was something that did not happen to her mother frequently. "I will tell you what I understood when I chose Alara," he said, and the use of her name, simple and direct in that moment, did something to Alara's chest that she could not immediately manage. "I understood that she runs a household with more competence than most men I have met manage their estates. I understood that she reads with genuine comprehension and argues with genuine intelligence. I understood that she has maintained both her integrity and her warmth across 9 years of treatment that would have made smaller people bitter." A pause, measured and deliberate. "I chose her because she is extraordinary. I would suggest that the extraordinary nature of the choice reflects considerably better on my judgment than on your assumptions." Silence. True silence. The kind that follows something that cannot be unsaid and would not be taken back. Alara was looking at the fire because she could not, at this particular moment, look at him. She was doing something she had not done in years, something she had specifically disciplined herself out of because it served no practical purpose. She was blinking quickly and repeatedly against a pressure behind her eyes that she refused to allow further expression. Her mother recovered first, because Lady Whitmore was if nothing else a woman of extraordinary social resilience. The conversation shifted, was redirected, was carefully walked back to more neutral ground. Tea was finished. Arrangements for the family to stay overnight. The carriages could not make the return journey before dark. Were managed by Mrs. Beale with the efficient displeasure of a housekeeper who has formed opinions about unexpected guests. Alara excused herself before dinner. She went to the walled garden, where the first green shoots of her mother's herb planting were beginning to emerge from the cold earth. She stood among them in the last gray light and breathed the sharp, clean moorland air and tried to conduct the internal accounting she usually found steadying. It was not steadying tonight. What Adrian had said in the drawing room was still moving through her, like weather, warm and disorienting, reaching places she had sealed against exactly this kind of reaching. He had defended her before. He had been courteous and protective in the small, practical ways that a decent man is courteous and protective. But this had been different. This had been specific. This had named her, not her scars, not her situation, not her usefulness, but her. The particular, irreducible her that she had spent years being certain no one saw. She heard the garden gate. She did not turn. He came and stood beside her among the emerging herb shoots, looking at the same gray distance she was looking at. The wind moved between them, cold and familiar. "I owe you an apology," he said. She turned then, surprised. For what? For what was said in there? His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who holds himself responsible for things that occur within his sphere. They should not have come here uninvited. I should have. "You are not responsible for my family," she said. "No," he said. "But you are in my house. You are under my," he stopped. "You are my wife. What is said to you here is something I have some say in." She looked at him in the dimming light. "What you said," she began, then stopped, because the sentence had several possible endings, and she was not certain which one she was ready for. "It was true," he said simply. "Every word." The first stars were appearing above the moor, faint and cold and very far away. The winter jasmine in her rooms would be catching the last of the warmth from the dying fire. In the morning there would be a book outside her door. Alara looked at Adrian Calloway, at the scar on his jaw and the gray at his temples and the contained, careful, overwhelming man behind those deep-water eyes, and felt the last of her careful distance begin, with quiet inevitability, to dissolve. "I know," she said softly, and that, for tonight, was enough. The Whitmore family departed the following morning before breakfast, which suited everyone involved. Alara watched the carriage from the library window, her window, the third-floor one, with the specific relief of a woman watching a weather system move off toward the horizon. Her mother had embraced her in the front hall with genuine feeling, which Alara received without flinching and without the old automatic bracing. Margot had held her hands again and said, quietly and with great precision, "He means it, you know. All of it." Cecilia had said nothing, which was in its own way more honest than anything she might have said, and Alara respected it. Her father had shaken Adrian's hand at length and said something private that Alara could not hear, and Adrian had listened with the serious attention he brought to things that mattered, and had nodded once. She had not asked what was said. She had the feeling she would understand it eventually without needing to ask. The house settled back into itself after they left. The particular quality of a Shenvale silence, which he had learned to read the way she read weather, its variations and textures and what they meant, returned gradually, like water finding its level. Mrs. Beale recovered her composure by mid-morning. The groundskeeper left a note about the rosemary. A fieldfare landed on the garden wall and regarded the world with the calm authority of a bird that has migrated several hundred miles and therefore has perspective on minor domestic disruptions. Alara spent the morning in the walled garden and the early afternoon in her room, and then, because she had been honest with herself for long enough to know that what she was doing was waiting, she went to the third-floor library. He was there. Of course he was there. He was in the reading chair at his particular angle to the window, with a book open in his lap that she could see from the doorway. He was not reading. He was looking at the moorland through the glass with the expression she had come to recognize as his thinking expression, not absent, not distant, intensely present in some interior place. He looked up when she entered. Something in his face reorganized itself. Not into performance, not into the social smoothing that most people applied automatically in company. Simply into awareness. Into the particular alertness that, she had come to understand, was what Adrian Calloway looked like when he was glad. She sat in her chair. He returned, or pretended to return, to his book. For 20 minutes they maintained the familiar shape of their library afternoons. The fire, the light, the quiet, the comfortable parallel occupation of shared space. Then she said, without looking up from her page, "You told my family I was extraordinary." "Yes," he said. "You said it as though it were simply a fact." "It is simply a fact." She turned a page she had not read. "Most people," she said carefully, "who have known me for 6 weeks do not arrive at that conclusion." "Most people," he said, with a dry precision that was his version of humor, "do not pay attention." She looked up then. He was watching her with that direct, undeflected attention. The book closed now in his lap, the pretense of reading set aside. "Adrian," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the buffer of his title, and she felt it land between them with a weight she had intended. Something shifted in his expression. An opening. The look of a man standing at a door he has kept closed for a long time, feeling the handle turn. "I need to understand something," she said. "Not for my own comfort. For accuracy. I have spent a long time being very accurate about my circumstances, and I cannot afford to be inaccurate now." "Ask me," he said. She set her book down. She folded her hands in her lap with the deliberate steadiness of a woman conducting something important. "The drawings," she said. "The books outside my door. The winter jasmine. The way you stood beside me yesterday in the drawing room." A pause. "What is this, Adrian? What are we doing?" The fire settled. The wind moved across the moor outside. He looked at her for a long moment with those deep water eyes, and she watched the contained, careful man behind them make a decision. He set his book on the table beside him. He leaned forward in his chair, forearms on his knees, hands loosely linked, bringing himself closer to her level. She noticed, closer to her, in the way he did when he meant to say something he wanted her to receive clearly. "I will tell you exactly what this is," he said. "If you want the honest version." "I always want the honest version." "I know," he said. "That is one of the things." He paused, gathered. "I came to your family's ball because I could not stop thinking about a woman I had seen for 20 minutes in a stationer's shop. I asked for you because you were the only person in that room who was simply, completely herself, and because I had forgotten," he stopped. Began again with greater precision. "I had taught myself to believe that what I wanted did not exist. That the quality of presence I had been looking for, honest, unperforming, genuinely itself, was either a fiction or something I had lost the capacity to recognize because I had been fooled by its imitation." He looked at his hands. "And then there you were, trimming ivy, with small scissors, as though the rest of the room did not exist." Ilara said nothing. The clock on the mantel marked the silence with quiet indifference. "What I have discovered in 6 weeks," he continued, and his voice was lower now, carrying the particular register of something said from an undefended place, "is that you are more than I observed in Ashford. You are," he paused, and she could see him selecting words with the care he brought to everything, refusing to be imprecise about something this significant. "You are the most honest person I have encountered in my adult life. You see clearly, and you say what you see, and you do not perform any version of yourself for anyone's benefit, including mine. You disagree with me, and you are right approximately as often as I am, which is, the ghost of something crossed his face. More than I expected, and more than I can tell you how much I value." He looked up at her then, directly, fully. "You have made this house feel inhabited again," he said. "Not occupied, inhabited. There is a difference. I had forgotten the difference. You reminded me of it by simply being here, which is," he stopped. Something moved through his expression, a crack in the careful exterior, not dramatic, not theatrical, just real. "Which is not a small thing, Ilara. After 6 years, it is not a small thing at all." She was very still. The firelight moved across the room. "What I am telling you," he said, quietly and with complete clarity, "is that what I feel for you is not arrangement. It is not convenience or practical compatibility, or the relief of having resolved a solitude that had become unsustainable. It is," he paused one final time, and when he continued his voice was the voice of a man putting down the last weight he has been carrying alone. I love you. That is what this is. I am aware it is too soon by conventional measurement, and I am aware that I have not been easy or uncomplicated or particularly legible, and I am not asking you to. I am not placing an expectation on you. I am simply telling you the truth because you asked for it, and because I am finished keeping it behind a door. The room was very quiet. Alara looked at the man across the firelight, at the careful, wounded, extraordinary man who had come to a ballroom after 6 years of silence, and pointed at the woman in the corner, the one with the scars and the small scissors, and had meant it with every quiet, deliberate, overwhelming piece of himself. She thought of 14-year-old Alara behind a hospital door, hearing her mother calculate. She thought of 17-year-old Alara watching her sisters receive their futures, while hers was left, by omission, unordered. She thought of all the careful years of useful invisibility, and the architecture she had built around the understanding that she was not someone who got chosen. Not like this. Not genuinely. She thought of the winter jasmine on her desk. The annotated line in the book about observation. The laugh he had laughed in this room that had rung through her like a bell. The way he had stood beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her, beside her, in the drawing room while her sister said the thing that was meant to diminish her. She thought of what Margot had said in the front hall this morning. Asterisk, he means it, you know. All of it, asterisk. She did know. That was the thing she had been most afraid of, not that he was lying, but that he was telling the truth, because the truth required her to do something she had not done in 9 very long and very careful years. It required her to believe she was worth it. She looked at Adrian. He was watching her with the patient, undemanding attention of a man who has said what he needed to say, and is prepared to wait as long as waiting requires. There was no pressure in his gaze. No performance. No management. Just him. Clear and real and terrifyingly sincere. I heard you, she said quietly. I know, he said. I need, she stopped. Breathed. I need to tell you something. Tomorrow. I need tonight to arrange myself around it. He nodded. No impatience. No deflation. Simply the steady acceptance of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed, and that the waiting, if what you are waiting for is real, is worth every hour of it. She rose from her chair. At the door she paused, hand on the frame, and said without turning, Adrian. Yes. The house feels inhabited to me too. A beat. I wanted you to know that. She did not wait for his response. She went down the stairs and through the east wing corridor and into her rooms, where the fire was warm and the winter jasmine was still alive on the writing desk, a small persistent brightness against the dark. She sat at the desk. She did not read. She did not write. She simply sat and let the walls she had spent 9 years constructing do what they had been doing, quietly and without her permission, since a duke had looked across a crowded ballroom and found her in her corner. She let them come down. She did not sleep. Not from agitation, or not only from agitation. It was something larger and less manageable than agitation. It was the particular wakefulness of a person standing at the edge of a significant thing, aware that the stepping forward is irrevocable and choosing, for one last night, to stand at the edge and look at what they are about to leave behind. What she was leaving behind was the architecture. The careful, functional, honestly constructed life she had built around the understanding of her own insufficiency. It had served her. She wanted to be fair to it in this last night of its existence. It had genuinely served her. It had kept her upright through years that would have flattened someone less deliberately constructed. It had given her purpose and competence, and a form of contentment that was real, even if it was smaller than what human beings, in their best and most vulnerable moments, are capable of hoping for. But it had also, she understood now with the clarity that comes only in the dark hours before dawn, been a cage she had called a house. And she had lived in it so long that she had confused the walls with safety. She rose before light. She dressed simply, without deliberation, a dress she liked, dark green wool, the color of the library walls. She pinned her hair with her usual efficiency and looked at herself in the mirror with the direct, unflinching honesty she brought to all self-examination. The scars looked back at her, silver and rose pink in the lamplight, tracing their familiar map across the left side of her face, down toward her jaw. She had looked at them every day for 9 years. She had made, across those years, a complicated and not always successful peace with them. There had been days of genuine acceptance and days of something raw, and she had learned to move through both without allowing either to govern her. But tonight she looked at them and thought of pencil drawings, precise and careful, made by a man who had apparently looked at her face so many times and with such sustained attention that he could reproduce it from memory, who had drawn her scars with the same quiet care he drew everything else about her. Not minimized, not heroized, simply present, simply hers, part of the face he could not stop returning to. She thought, if he can see them that way, perhaps I can too. She took her lamp and went downstairs. She had expected the house to be dark and fully silent, but as she reached the ground floor, she saw the thin line of firelight beneath the study door. She stopped, looked at it, understood that she should not be surprised, that a man who had spent 6 years in solitude had almost certainly long since abandoned the social convention of sleeping when night suggested it. She knocked softly. There was a brief silence, then, "Come in." He was at his desk, which was covered in correspondence. He had clearly been working through rather than sitting with the organized industry of a man who had decided to be useful rather than lie awake. He rose when she entered, and she saw in his face the immediate, searching attention he always gave her, reading her the way she had learned to read him, looking for what she needed so he could calibrate accordingly. He looked tired. He had not slept either. "Ilara," he said, simply, the way he always said her name, like it meant exactly itself and nothing required adding. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. She took the chair across the desk from him, not the formal arrangement of their first meeting in the Whitmore Library, but something more equal. Two people in a firelit room at an hour that belongs to honesty. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to say it correctly. So I'm going to ask you not to speak until I have finished." He nodded, patient, still. "I was 14 years old," she began, "when I learned that my value to my family was conditional. Not stated, it was never stated. My mother would have been appalled at the suggestion. But demonstrated. Quietly and consistently and without malice, which almost made it worse, because malice can be argued with and quiet demonstration simply accumulates." She breathed. Steadied. "I built my life around the conclusion I drew from that demonstration. That I was useful but not wanted. That I could be necessary without being chosen. I became very good at both, at being necessary and at not expecting to be chosen. And I told myself that this was a reasonable and mature accommodation to reality, and for a long time I believed it." She looked at the fire briefly, and then back at him. "And then you came to a ballroom," she said, "and you pointed at me. And every careful thing I had constructed began to crack. And I have spent 6 weeks trying to repair the cracks, because the architecture felt safer than the alternative." He was very still across the desk. His hands were flat on the correspondence. The only sign of the effort the stillness was costing him. "The alternative," she continued, "requires me to believe something I have not believed for 9 years. It requires me to believe that I am worth choosing. Not despite what I am, not despite the scars or the quietness or the 9 years of practiced invisibility, but because of what I am. Because of all of it. Because the woman who stands in the middle of a ballroom trimming ivy, and the woman who argues with dead essayists, and the woman who gets mud on her knees in a November garden, and the woman who cannot sleep at 3 in the morning because she is standing at the edge of something large. That woman is someone you looked at and chose. Deliberately. With full knowledge. Repeatedly. She unclenched her hands. Laid them open in her lap. "I have been so afraid," she said, and her voice did something she had not given it permission to do. It went soft at the edges, briefly, before she steadied it. "Not of you. Of being wrong. Of dismantling everything I built and discovering that the foundation I thought I was building on was not real. I have been wrong about what was real before, or rather the world has been wrong about me in ways that I eventually internalized. I did not want to internalize another wrongness." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the contained, careful Adrian of their careful weeks, but something more open than she had yet witnessed. His deep-water eyes were very bright in the firelight. "But I sat at my desk tonight," she said, "and I looked at the winter jasmine, and I thought about every book left outside my door, and every conversation in the library and the garden and the moor path. And I thought about what you said yesterday afternoon, not the part that was about my family, but the part that was about me. The part where you said I reminded you of the difference between occupied and inhabited." She paused. "And I understood that I cannot keep choosing the architecture over the truth. I cannot keep choosing the cage over the door simply because the door frightens me. That is not the woman I want to be. That is not, if I am being completely honest, the woman I am." She took a breath, held it, released it. "I love you," she said. "I want to say it plainly, without condition or qualification, because you said it plainly to me, and you deserve the same in return from the beginning. I love you. I have been loving you with increasing alarm for several weeks, and I am finished pretending otherwise, and I am choosing to believe that you meant what you said, not because I am naive, but because I have paid very careful attention to you, Adrian, and you do not say things you do not mean." The study was very quiet. The fire breathed. Outside the moor lay dark and sleeping under a sky beginning, imperceptibly, to lighten at its eastern edge. He rose from behind the desk. He came around it slowly and stood before her, and she rose to meet him because she was not a woman who received significant moments sitting down. They stood close in the firelight, close enough that she could see the exact quality of what was in his expression. Not triumph, not relief, though both were present in smaller quantities beneath the larger thing. The larger thing was something she had no single adequate word for. Recognition. Arrival. The look of a man who has navigated a very long way through difficult water and has come, at last, to shore. He raised his hand and touched her face. Gently, his fingers traced, with the same careful attention of his pencil in those drawings, the line of her scar from her temple to her jaw. Not around it, along it, as though it were simply part of the topography of something he intended to know completely. "I meant every word," he said. "I will keep meaning it. That is not something you will need to verify repeatedly, though I understand if it takes time to trust it. I am a patient man." "I know," she said. "It is one of the things." Something broke across his face then, the last of it, the final careful holding. He bent his head and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that in the firelit study while the night finished and the dawn began. Two people who had spent a long time being careful, finally allowing themselves, in the dark and the quiet and the warmth of a house that had learned, slowly and surely, to feel like home, to simply be still in the same place without the weight of caution between them. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and real and entirely itself, like everything he did. She felt it the way she had felt his laugh that afternoon in the library, as a resonance, something that moved through her and did not stop when the immediate moment ended, something that would keep moving for a long time yet. Outside, the first pale light was finding the moorland. The heather was beginning to resolve from darkness into its true colors. The winter jasmine on her desk upstairs was catching the earliest edge of dawn. And in the walled garden, beneath the February soil, her mother's lavender was quietly, persistently, doing what living things do when they have been neglected and cold and left without attention for too long. It was preparing, in its own time and according to its own nature, to bloom. Spring came to Shenvale the way it comes to moorland, not with the sudden, performative arrival of southern springs, all blossoms and fanfare, but gradually and seriously, as though the land had considered the matter at length and decided, with characteristic northern deliberateness, that warmth was worth committing to. The heather green first, then the walled garden, which Alara had spent the latter weeks of winter clearing and feeding and planning with the focused attention she brought to all things worth doing properly. By the first week of April, the lavender her mother-in-law had planted, the lavender she had found beneath 3 years of neglect on a cold Tuesday morning that felt, now, like a different life, had pushed through the soil with the quiet confidence of something that had always intended to return. She was on her knees among it when Adrian came through the gate. She heard him and did not look up immediately. She had learned the particular sound of his footsteps, the unhurried, deliberate rhythm of a man who walks, as though he has decided to be where he is going and sees no purpose in pretending otherwise. She finished what she was doing, pressing the soil gently around a new stem, and then sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was carrying 2 cups of tea. He had made a habit of this, appearing at 11 o'clock with tea, regardless of where she was or what she was doing, with the comfortable regularity of a man who has found a ritual he intends to keep. She had mentioned once that she found it useful. He had not made a production of continuing it. He had simply continued it. She took her cup. He lowered himself to sit on the old stone bench at the garden center, the one she had unearthed in February, another of his mother's quiet gifts, and they sat together in the thin April sunlight while the moorland wind moved through the garden, and the lavender lifted its first pale green heads toward the light. "Letter from Margot," he said, producing it from his coat pocket. "What does she say?" "I did not read it. It is addressed to you." She smiled at this, because she knew he was entirely capable of reading it. Letters in the Whitmore household had always been considered communal property by necessity, and that his restraint was deliberate and consistent, and something she had stopped finding surprising and started finding simply characteristic. Part of the landscape of him. Part of what she navigated daily with increasing ease and increasing gratitude. She read the letter. Margot had secured a position as companion to a countess in Edinburgh. A good situation, by the sound of it, with a woman of genuine intelligence and reasonable temperament who valued Margot's particular brand of sharp-edged charm. There was a postscript. *, tell the Duke I have revised my opinion of him upward considerably. Tell him also that, if he is ever less than everything you deserve, I know people. *. She passed the letter to Adrian. He read the postscript and the ghost of something crossed his face. The expression she had come to love most, the one that was his version of being amused, which in another man might have been a full laugh, but in him was this: a quieting of the eyes, a barely perceptible curve at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man containing something warm. "Tell her," he said, "that the warning is noted and taken seriously. I will tell her nothing of the kind. It will encourage her. It should encourage her. She is entirely correct." Ilara looked at him over her tea. The April light was doing something particular to the angles of his face, softening them slightly, or perhaps that was simply what 6 weeks of mornings had done to her perception of him. She was not certain she could separate the two. She was not certain she wished to. There had been a letter from her mother, as well, that week, a careful, elaborate, somewhat effortful letter that was, if read with charity, an attempt at something like acknowledgement. Not apology, exactly. Lady Whitmore was not architecturally suited to direct apology, but something adjacent, a recognition perhaps, delivered in the oblique language of a woman who has lived too long in indirection to abandon it entirely, that things had been, at certain points, managed poorly, that Ilara had been, at certain points, insufficiently seen. Ilara had read it 3 times. She had not yet decided what to do with it. She was not. She had told Adrian that evening in the study. Ready to perform forgiveness, she had not yet arrived at honestly. He had said that was entirely reasonable, and that she should take whatever time the matter required, and that he would be here when she was ready to talk further about it, and that there was no urgency. No urgency. She had turned the phrase over in her mind afterward, struck by it. No urgency. She had spent so many years operating under the constant low-level urgency of a household in difficulty, a family in negotiation, a life in managed decline. The absence of it was something she was still learning to inhabit without suspicion. She was learning a great many things. In this first season of a life she had not known to want until it appeared before her with small scissors in hand, pointing at her corner. She was learning that she could disagree with a man in the evening and love him in the morning, and that neither canceled the other. She was learning that being known, fully, specifically, without the flattering blur of idealization, was not the vulnerability she had feared, but something closer to its opposite. She was learning that the walled garden her mother-in-law had planted 20 years ago, left for 3 years to its own devices, and then found and tended and coaxed back toward itself, was perhaps the most apt metaphor her life had yet produced, and that she was still deciding whether this was profound or simply convenient. She suspected it was both. Adrian set down his empty cup and looked at her in the way he looked at her, directly, without apology, with the settled attention of a man who has found what he was looking for and has no intention of looking away. She had stopped finding this disconcerting approximately 3 weeks ago. She had started finding it with the honest acknowledgement she owed herself and him, the thing she looked forward to most in each day. Being seen. Specifically by him. "The lavender's coming," she said. "It is. Your mother had good taste." "I have thought lately," he said, with the careful precision he brought to significant statements, "that she would have liked you very much." Alara looked at the lavender. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had planted a garden on a windswept moor and then left it too soon, and whose quiet investment in growing things had waited patiently under the cold earth for years until someone came along who knew how to look. She thought about what it meant, being liked by the people who matter to the people who matter to you. She thought about how she had once placed herself entirely outside the possibility of such things, and how strange it was to find herself, at 23, irrevocably and gratefully inside them. "I think," she said, "I would have liked her too." The wind moved through the garden. The lavender lifted. The moorland spread away beyond the walls, vast and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small, luminous human happiness occurring in its midst, which was, Alara had come to understand, exactly as it should be. The moor did not need to concern itself with them. They were doing perfectly well on their own. She finished her tea. She would return to the lavender. He would return to whatever correspondence the morning had brought. They would meet at dinner and disagree about something and agree about something else, and sit afterward in the third-floor library in their respective chairs in the firelight, reading in the comfortable parallel silence of two people who have found, in each other, the rarest and most sustaining thing available to human beings. A companion who makes solitude better and company better simultaneously. She did not know what the years ahead held. She was not, by temperament, a woman who needed to know. She had learned too well the unreliability of planned futures to invest heavily in their architecture. What she knew was today this garden, this light, this man on the stone bench with his empty cup and his attentive eyes. What she knew was that the woman who had stood in a corner with small scissors and practiced invisibility and told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that hope was a candle best kept unlit, that woman had been wrong. Not weak, not foolish, not unforgivably mistaken. Simply wrong, in the way that people are wrong when they draw conclusions from insufficient evidence, when they mistake the conditions of the wound for the conditions of the world. The world, it turned out, was larger than the wound. She had simply needed someone to point across a crowded room and find her in her corner to begin to understand it. She rose from the earth. She brushed the soil from her knees. Adrian looked up at her, and she looked back at him. And between them in the April garden was everything that had been said and everything that did not need saying, and the quiet, unshakable foundation of a life being built, not on performance, not on arrangement, not on the mutual negotiation of tolerable loneliness, but on the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of two people who had learned to see and chosen, every day, to keep looking. "Come back inside when you're ready," he said. "I will," she said. She turned back to her lavender. Behind her, she heard him rise and cross the garden and pause at the gate, and then, because she knew him, she knew he paused to look back once before he went. She did not turn, but she felt it, the way she had learned to feel all his quiet attentions, as warmth, as steadiness, as the accumulated evidence of a man who meant what he said and would keep meaning it. The gate closed softly. The garden held its light. She pressed her hands into the good dark earth and felt it, solid and real and full of things still growing, beneath her palms. Thank you so much for watching this story through to its end. If Alara and Adrian's journey moved you, if you found yourself in her corner, in her careful and visible life, in the long work of learning to believe you are worth choosing, then this story did what stories are meant to do. Drop in the comments the moment that stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this channel because there are more stories waiting, More corners, more dukes, more women with small scissors and large hearts who are about to have their lives irrevocably changed. Until next time, dear friends, keep watching, keep feeling, and remember, the right person will always find you in your corner. Asterisk.